Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Let's talk about reflexes now. So this is like the last part of neurons, and then we're going to get into the brain, which is always a fun part. So a reflex is a rapid, so definition, a reflex is a rapid, predictable, involuntary response to a stimulus. And reflexes occur on what we call reflex arcs. So there are two major groups of reflexes, somatic reflexes and autonomic reflexes. And I'm always amazed when I talk about a reflex, people assume that a reflex occurs on, since it's involuntary, it occurs in like smooth and cardiac muscle, but not skeletal muscle. But we have reflexes for skeletal muscle as well, and those are somatic reflexes. So a reflex that stimulates any skeletal muscle is a somatic reflex. So an example is that withdrawal reflex that you have. So think about when you touch something hot. If your hand touches a stove and the stove is very hot, you immediately move your hand away. That is going to protect you from getting burnt. And so that would be a withdrawal reflex, and that is stimulating skeletal muscle. An autonomic reflex, the other reflex, stimulates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glandular tissue. So these are things that we don't have control over. These are involuntary structures, and of course a reflex is involuntary anyways. There are five basic parts to a reflex arc. So we have sensory receptors that take in a stimulus. These sensory receptors send signals through sensory neurons or afferent neurons to the integration center in the CNS. The integration center then processes that information and decides what to do and sends a response through motor neurons. Motor neurons, or the efferent neurons, carry the information back to an effector, and the effector is what brings about change. So it's going to cause muscle contraction or glandular release. So let's look at those five parts. Here we have the receptor. In this case, we're looking at the skin as our receptor. Something has stimulated, and in this case, it's a nail is poking into the skin. So this would be like a withdrawal reflex. Information moves through this afferent neuron to the integration center. Integration center in the CNS determines what has to be done and sends a response through the efferent neuron or the motor neuron to the effector, and the effector is going to bring about change by contracting, moving your hand away from that nail. So there are two groups of reflexes we'll talk about. The two neuron reflex, which is a simple reflex. So an example would be like the patellar reflex, the patellar or the knee jerk reflex that you have done every time you go to a doctor for a checkup, and they hit right below the patella. So in this case, you have sensory receptors are going to pick up the smack with the little hammer. The sensory receptors pull in the information and send it to the integration, but there's no actual like integration center. So sensory receptors basically act as the integration region within the CNS and send a response through the efferent neuron, the motor neuron, to the effector, and the effector then contracts, causing your leg to jerk. A three-neuron reflex consists of the sensory neuron, the interneuron, and the motor neuron. Okay, so I went through this, but I'll show you again. This is the withdrawal reflex. Here you have a tack. Your finger hits the tack. Sensory receptors send signals to the integration center. The integration center determines what has to be done and sends a response out through the motor neuron to the skeletal muscle. And the skeletal muscle brings about change by contracting and moving your hand away from that tack. So now you should be able to tell me what a reflex is and the difference between somatic and autonomic reflexes. Okay. So now let's get into the brain. So there are different regions of the brain, and each region of the brain has its own major functions. Okay, so the cerebrum or cerebral hemispheres are the large top portion of the brain, and those are the part of the brain most people think about when they think of the brain. That's for your conscious awareness. You have the diencephalon, which has a lot of really important parts, specifically hypothalamus, which is your homeostatic region. I mean, all regions are for homeostasis in some sense, but hypothalamus really maintains a lot of the different homeostatic mechanisms. The brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. This region is important in breathing, in cardiac function, and in sending, of course, information from the spinal cord to the cerebrum. And then we have the cerebellum, which is your coordination center. So let's look at each of these a little bit closer. The cerebrum has two different hemispheres, a right and left, and they're attached actually by a structure, by a neural tract called the corpus callosum. So if that corpus callosum were cut, then the cerebral hemispheres would be completely separated. Within the cerebrum, we have a lot of ridges called gyri and grooves called sulci. There are really deep grooves called fissures. And then the lobes of the cerebrum are named for the bones that they lie on. The outer region of the cortex is known as the gray matter, and then deep to the gray matter we have white matter. Within the white matter are pockets of more gray matter called basal nuclei. And so here is a picture. I love this picture. This is an autopsy. And so this is a brain from an autopsy that we now have a beautiful picture of. This outer region is that gray matter. Deep to the gray matter, we have the white matter. And then within the white matter of the cerebrum, we have those basal nuclei. So here you have the frontal lobe, which sits deep to the frontal bone. We have the parietal lobe, which would be deep to the parietal bone. We have the temporal lobe, deep to the temporal lobe, or temporal bone, I'm sorry, and then the occipital lobe, deep to the occipital bone. You can see the gyri and the sulci around here. The really deep sulci are called the fissures. So here's a not so deep, and here's a very deep sulcus. That's known as a fissure, okay? This just talks about each of the parts of the brain. I'm not going to go over this, but I thought it was important to keep here so that you have this information, or so that you can read this information. I'm going to go over it on my own in each part, okay? So the cerebral cortex has specific functions depending on the region. There's a primary somatic sensory region. This is located within the parietal lobe, and it's somatic sensory, so it receives impulses for your touch, pain, temperature, pressure, anything to deal with the somatic regions of the body. So stuff that we are consciously aware of. Um, and you will look at the sensory homunculus in a slide coming up. Apologies, I don't know why I couldn't talk for a second. And so whatever occurs on the left side of the brain is actually processed on the right side. So left side of, or I should say, whatever is sent in from the left side of the body is processed on the right side of the brain and vice versa. So the right side of our brain controls the left side of our body. Left side of our brain controls the right side of our body. And so here's that primary somatic sensory region that we were talking about. This region is going to take in sensory information from the environment. If you feel something on your skin, if you feel something on your hair or in your hair, if you're cold, or if you touch something hot, if you feel pain, all of those are going to be sent to that somatic sensory region of the brain in the parietal lobe. And so when you're looking at the somatic sensory region, here you can see the sensory homunculus. And so if you look here, you can see how much of the body is actually associated with that sensory homunculus. So the larger the region, the more sensory receptors we have. So a lot of people are always surprised. Our tongue, our mouth, our face has a lot of sensory receptors. Whereas things like our elbow, our arm, not a lot. Our hand does. Our neck, a little bit. All of these, leg, hip, knee, they don't get a lot of information. That's a really small amount compared to your hands and your face. And your genital region gets very little stimulation, has very few receptors compared to other parts of the body. Your feet have a lot more. And so you can see here where the majority of your receptors are located in areas of the body that are really important for sensory interpretation. And think about everything in the face. We have stimulation for taste, smell, sight, our hands. We have to be able to feel things so that we can manipulate the world around us. So that's why those areas are going to be so much, or have so many more receptors associated with them. So there are certain areas of the brain that have special sensations. So the visual area is in the occipital lobe. Auditory area, is the temporal lobe, and olfactory area is also the temporal lobe. So damage to the occipital lobe could potentially cause problems with vision. If you had damage to the temporal lobe, that could cause problems with audition or olfaction. Here you can see the visual area in the occipital lobe. And over here you can see both olfaction and audition, so hearing and smell, in the temporal lobe. So when you look at the cerebral cortex, you saw that somatic sensory region. If you look on the opposite side of the central sulcus, you then see the primary motor region. So this is the region that allows us to move our skeletal muscle. So again, here's the post-central region where you have the somatic sensory, and here is where you have the somatic, or the somatic motor region. Okay. Here's your motor homunculus. So over here we looked at it. Now we're looking over here. And again, the motor homunculus shows the majority of the information for that is sent from sensory information to the motor region for response is in our face and our hands. And you should know that the reason for that is because we have a lot of special senses in the face, and we need to be able to manipulate the world so we can survive. The rest of our body is very small, so very little amounts of motor information move through the rest of the body. We have some specialized areas for speech as well. So Broca's area is typically found only in one hemisphere, and it helps us with our ability to speak. So if this area is damaged, then our ability to speak is often compromised. There's association areas in the frontal lobe, and then we have other speech areas for helping us learn words. And so if we look here, you can see Broca's speech area is right here in the frontal lobe. And that's a really important region. We have problem solving and language comprehension up here in the frontal lobe. So when you have damage to that frontal lobe, a lot of times your ability to speak can be damaged, or can be compromised, I should say, or comprehension can be compromised. So let's look, actually, hold on, I'm going to check and see where we're at, and then I will decide if I'm going to keep going, okay? I'm actually going to stop here so that I can pick up on the next slides, because I have a few more slides before I get to my next stopping point, and I really think this is long enough. So I will see you in our next video. Bye.